This is a Momentum Media production.
Welcome to the Smart Property Investment Show, the podcast by investors for investors.
Hello everyone, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Smart Property Investment Show. I'm Grace Ormsby and today we've got something a little bit different for you. One of my colleagues here at Momentum Media, Jerome Doraisamy, the editor of Lawyers Weekly, recently sat down with the Honourable Kevin Bell, former Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria and a patron of Tenants Victoria, to really go behind the scenes of Australia's housing crisis and discuss what is going on at the moment. And it really is worth a listen. I hope you enjoy it.
Kevin, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jerome. It's great to be here. I'm coming to you from Bunurong country on the Mornington Peninsula.
Fantastic. Now, Kevin has recently penned a book called Housing the Great Australian Right. This is the latest volume in Monash University Publishing's series titled In the National Interest. And I'm very interested to hear what Kevin has to say about the housing crisis, or the housing disaster, as he refers to it, in this new book, and what needs to be done moving forward to ensure that all Australians up and down the country have access to the fundamental right of housing. Kevin, before we get into the book and your central thesis, I'm keen to learn a little bit more about yourself. So I detailed a bit of your extensive resume in that introduction, but for the benefit of our listeners, could you give us a bit of a rundown of your career?
My career in the law began in the late 70s when I started working with the Tenants Union in Melbourne, and that gave me an immediate understanding about how poorly the law protected a vulnerable group, being tenants. And I've always, in the course of my career, been focused as much as possible upon the use of the law to achieve human rights, equality, social justice. And I think that that purpose began at that early stage working for the Tenants Union. And so I'm really delighted to be the patron of Tenants Victoria, as somebody described it recently. It's a real full circle.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the full circle, I understand you also grew up in social housing. Is that correct?
That is true. I grew up in an era in which government support for housing was seen to be fundamental to economic and social reconstruction in the post-war period. And I am very conscious of how that prepared me for a fulfilling life, economically, socially, personally, in terms of my family, and in all dimensions of my life. And one of the reasons I've written the book to which you referred, and thank you for your interest in the book, is that I feel that I had something that young people now don't have, which is access to housing as of right.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so much that we can and will dive into on that front. But I do want to ask you firstly to elaborate a bit on your passion, for housing in Australia, and why this is so fundamentally important to you on a personal level.
It's fundamentally important to me on a personal level because my own upbringing proved to me how it meant everything to me as an individual, as an adult growing up. I was prepared for life by housing. There's a certain philosophy now called housing first, which is important internationally as an approach to enable people to flourish and to achieve their full potential. And it didn't have that name then, but really what the government was doing when I grew up was to accept that you must have housing first. And the idea of having housing first is connected with being able to have health, being able to have work, being able to have social connection with your community, be able to develop in the family setting and yourself individually. So I do have a passion for this, and I'm trying to express that passion through the book and through my commitment to the human rights dimension of housing, to which we'll come. But it really emanates from my own personal background and my own work. And I feel that Australia has lost its way in a major way. We have a housing disaster on our hands now. And I contrast the present situation with the way it was when I grew up, and I see a yawning gap, and I feel a sense of responsibility to try and close that gap, indeed eliminate it.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the book. So it's called "Housing: The Great Australian Right," which I understand from having started to read the book.
Yes.
I haven't finished it yet, I must confess, and I'm going to blame that on the fact that we have a newborn at home.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. But the title, "Housing: The Great Australian Right," is, as I understand it from the book, to be, a play on the idea of the Great Australian Dream.
It is.
And, as you've said, we're currently experiencing a housing disaster, and that dream is just way out of reach for so many of people, including and especially, young Australians and First Nations Australians. And so I wanted to, I guess, start off by asking you about this disaster that you describe. Could you unpack that for us?
I can unpack it. Australia has a housing system comprised of 4 parts, and each of them are in a disastrous state. First is home ownership, and anybody trying to buy a home, whether it be an apartment or a house, would know how difficult that is. Housing affordability has never been worse than it is now. I can't keep up with the statistics. Every day, one picks up a form of media and sees a statistic showing that it's got even worse than it did in the last reporting period. I think we've reached the stage where 2 people on good wages in work, having worked hard to get a job and get an education, can't afford to buy a home a reasonable distance from a capital city anywhere in Australia. That is, I think, a catastrophic situation. So housing unaffordability is just worse than it has ever been, and has provoked my interest in trying to rethink this and to ask why, and to suggest ways that we can reimagine the housing world so that everybody has access to what I did and my parents did as a child. The next part of the housing system is rental housing, and the picture there is much the same. Rents are extraordinarily high. There are parts of Australia where there is no affordable rental housing for people on ordinary incomes. Literally no affordable rental housing for people on ordinary income. That's a parlous state of affairs. And it's a situation that's occurred because of the way that our housing system is structured, because of the interaction between investment law or investment policy and residential tenancy. And so that's the second part of it. The third part of it is public housing. And public housing in this country used to be seen to be the responsibility of government as part of a pattern of measures to ensure that everybody would have access to housing. That's the kind of system in which I grew up. But unfortunately, public housing expenditure in this country has declined to pitifully low levels. And we have nothing like the amount of public housing investment in this country that is necessary to meet the need for that form of housing. And so we need drastically increased public expenditure in public housing as part of the solution to addressing this problem. But it's not the only thing that needs to be done. And the fourth area is homelessness, and homelessness in this land of plenty is at very high rates, which should shock the conscience of the community. And it certainly shocks my conscience. We've got more than 120,000 people homeless in this country as at the last census. And the next one is due in a year or two, and I'm fearful that it will be even greater. We see it with the obvious sight of people rough sleeping. I see it. People listening and watching, I'm sure, will have a consciousness because it's before our very eyes. We can solve this. It's within our capacity. but we aren't, and we need to do more. We can beat homelessness. There's no question that homelessness exists because of structural failure in the housing system. Homelessness is existing on our watch, and we can do something about it, and yet we do not.
Yeah. We're chatting with the Honourable Kevin Bell, former Supreme Court judge in Victoria, and we'll be back with more right after this.
Imagine being rushed to hospital.
Yep.
And your life changing in an instant. Imagine going through hundreds of tests and 46 weeks of chemo. Now imagine you're a child. That's why Starlight exists. To bring happiness to seriously ill children. Please donate at starlight.org.au.
Kevin, I want to dive a bit deeper into that four-pronged system that you were outlining just before. But as a sort of broader or overarching question, I'm curious in, this idea of housing being a right rather than a dream. And I'm wondering if, in coming up with practical, solutions and strategies, on a policy front, at the governmental level, if what perhaps we first need to do is to realign our mindsets to have housing be a right, in the minds of all Australians as opposed to a luxury. Is that perhaps the starting point for actually recognising that there's a serious problem?
I believe it is. I think the first step has to be for us to realign our values. Our values at the moment with respect to housing are to place profit first, not people. And I think the disastrous situation that we confront has its root cause in that problem. We have begun to treat housing as a matter of economics, as a matter of investment, as a matter of profit, as a way of defining the state that we have in the world. Rather than as a form of shelter, as a place in which we create our home, as the centre of our social, or our working, or our spiritual, or our other lives, and that began probably about in the last 25 years of the last century. So from, say, 75 to 2000, when public expenditure in public housing began to slide away, when home ownership became the thing almost to define us as such, the idea of the great Australian dream being the thing to which we all aspire. Life is a lot richer than that. But it's a nightmare anyway. It's not a dream anymore. People haven't got access to it. So there's no point in calling it a dream. We need to rethink our whole approach to this. So we have got the system we deserve now because we have values which place such emphasis upon the economic dimension of a home, and that needs to fundamentally change. Human rights is the way to understand housing. Human rights sees housing as something that is a fundamental human need so strong that it counts as a right, which it is government's responsibility to fulfil. Human rights sees housing as having several dimensions. It has to be adequate. It has to be good quality. It has to be accessible. It has to be safe. It needs to be available. It needs to be addressed in terms of the needs of the most vulnerable first. So you can see that the human dimension of housing is so much more strongly represented in the idea of housing as a right, and that's why I'm promoting that we rethink our attitude, reframe the debate. In terms of not just spending money, not just throwing, more millions or even billions at housing, important as that is, but rather shift from one thing, seeing housing as a form of profit, to another thing, seeing housing as fundamental to human life itself.
Yeah, well, it sounds as though from what you're saying that even the idea of calling housing the Great Australian Dream, as it has been for decades gone by, perhaps that has led us down the garden path of having housing become a status symbol or something that is more tied to, investment or commodification as opposed to shelter. But I did want to ask you if you see this as being a uniquely Australian problem. Obviously, so much of our population lives on the coast, and having a waterfront property is certainly seen as being a very important thing by many people. So, I mean, do you think, given Australia's position in the world and the fact that so much of the population lives on the coast, that perhaps this is something that is exacerbated by virtue of the fact that we live here in Australia?
It's worse here than elsewhere, but financialisation, which is the technical expression that's used, of housing is a problem internationally. Financialisation is the way in which housing has become treated in modern economies as an economic opportunity, and it's a problem even in Europe and in Canada and elsewhere. So the answer to your question is yes. Countries other than Australia have problems due to a common cause, but in Australia it's worse. Our housing unaffordability problems, both with respect to home ownership and rental housing, are among the highest in the world internationally. And so those states, and Europe has many countries to which I could point, where human rights are a foundation of their housing systems, are faring better. There is stronger government investment. There is more regulation. There is less landlordism. By which I mean small scale landlordism than we have here. And so the evidence is in that countries that respect human rights and have government policies and laws which reflect that respect do better in this situation than we are.
Yeah. So how do we even begin to alter the mindsets of Australians across the community? I imagine that, and I'm perhaps putting words in your mouth here, but I imagine that there would be a lot of reticence for people's homes to be suddenly valued at a lower price than they were yesterday. So from your perspective, what does it mean for us to change the mindset, and how can we go about that?
The first thing we have to do is that we have to adopt a strong moral perspective on housing, which values housing as a right which everybody has, so that literally all generations of people, each generation can have that which is fundamental to their lives, which is housing. And I re-emphasise that this is a question of fundamental values. We are looking at ourselves as a nation here. We are asking something about ourselves which will affect future generations. This question is that important, and I'm arguing that if you accept that housing is a right which we all have, then that needs to be brought into Australian law, both state and federal. There needs to be something transformational happen. Just treating this as a question of market regulation and government investment and spending a bit of money here and a bit of money there, that I want to suggest is just the same old way of looking at this.
Yeah.
And we have to look at this fundamentally differently, and accepting that housing is a right and acting on it in law and policy is that way.
But before we get into what such a national or state and territory plan could look like, Kevin, I want to ask if you see any appetite for such change, whether it be at a sort of state or federal government level, or more broadly across the community. Do we have the requisite quorum of demand for such change right now, or do we still need more of a groundswell?
I think we're up against it in this country for a few reasons, and I acknowledge that the arguments that I'm putting forward will take time to be accepted, and I'm I'm just asking for due consideration of what I'm saying as part of a pattern of measures to address this problem. We're up against it because we don't have a strong human rights culture in Australia. We don't have a National Human Rights Act. And although we are moving in that direction, and I welcome that and call for that to happen at great speed, we at the moment do not have that. The Australian Human Rights Commission has done a lot in the last 10 years to try to increase the level of knowledge about human rights in Australia, and I applaud that, but we have some way to go. We have got some human rights acts in states and territories, but they don't include housing as a right, and that's a problem. So we don't have a strong foundation, and we need to build that foundation. I want to suggest that the housing disaster is indeed partly a product of that lack of strong human rights culture in this country. If we had that culture and we saw housing as part of it, then I think we wouldn't have had this fascination with housing as an investment, because there'd be a counter to it. We'd see that it's not just an investment, it's actually about people, because it's a right. That's one of the reasons I'm now suggesting that we should adopt it. But to come to the second part of your question, which is, how is there an appetite developing? I think there is. And I'm really pleased at the response to the early stages of the release of the book. It's been very encouraging. There's been a lot of letters written to newspapers and news media. There's a lot of debate. I'm being given the opportunity on this important program that provides services to lawyers to express these views. I think that this is part of it. So I'm hoping that the politicians of whatever colour will see that there is something deeply lacking, which we need, and that is a human perspective on housing and an understanding that we can't just have the same structure and treat it in the same way. Something transformative needs to happen, and adopting a human rights approach represents that transformative opportunity.
Well, I want to dive into what such a plan and approach will look like, Kevin, and we'll get to that on the other side of this. So, Kevin, and I'm cribbing from the back jacket of the book here. The blurb of the book says the realization of the human right to a decent home must be the purpose of the housing system. For this to occur, there must be a national housing and homelessness plan that is rights-based, comprehensive, strategic, and legislated. So I may be sort of asking you to summarize something that is very comprehensive into a shorter answer here, but for the benefit of our listeners, before they go out and buy a copy of your book, of course, what does this national plan look like?
We don't have a national plan. In fact, we've never had one, which says a lot, doesn't it? Yeah. We almost had one in the 40s, but we didn't, and none since then. So clearly, part of the reason why this disaster has occurred is that we have seen housing as a second tier issue, and having a national housing and homelessness plan is intended to elevate it right up to a top tier issue. The government, to its credit, the federal government in collaboration with the state and territory governments is formulating a plan at the moment, and I applaud that. But I'm worried about aspects of that. And the first thing I'm worried about is that it's not legislative. At least at the present time, the government's expressed intention is for this to be a policy-based instrument. And it shouldn't be. It should be a legislative instrument, because we need to embed it in law in order that the impact of the plan is enduring. Of course, that law needs to respect the federation. States have responsibilities. National Parliament has responsibilities, etc. So it'll be a law of a certain kind, but it needs to be, in my view, law. The second thing is that it needs to be rights-based. So it needs to declare the right to housing as being the absolute foundation of the whole exercise. In other words, that the purpose of the plan is to give effect to and realise the right to housing. Now, this brings me to one of the strongest points I want to make with respect to a rights-based approach. A rights-based approach accepts or is based upon the idea that we equally, everybody in Australia, have a right to housing. And therefore, any plan needs to meet that individual need of everybody. And at the present time, I do not see a debate based on meeting the entire need of the whole community for housing. The debate at the moment, including the debate about this plan, is spending more money than was previously spent. Not much was spent previously. Therefore, to say right now we're going to spend $10 billion sounds like a wonderful thing to do, or $20 billion sounds like a wonderful thing to do, or even $30 billion sounds like a wonderful thing to do. The trouble is that expenditure, even of that great dimension, is not enough to make housing affordable for the entire Australian population. We've probably got a $200 billion problem on our hands. And in order to address that, we're going to need to have to plan over 2 generations. Something completely different to what we've been doing needs to happen. Not just spending money, but spending money towards meeting the entire need of everybody in Australia for housing over the longer term. And only a planned approach can achieve that end. And that's not the kind of plan that I see being developed at the moment. Yeah. Now, that's one aspect of it, Jerome. Another aspect of it I've already mentioned, which is the need to invest far more heavily in public housing. I don't want to develop that point further. But the third aspect I do want to develop is this question of residential tenancies. Yep. I saw a really disturbing article in the media a couple of days ago by an institute in Sydney, which said that of those young people seeking to access housing in Sydney now, 1/2 will never have home ownership as that form of housing. That half will always have residential tenancy as their form of housing over the course of their entire lives. Now, I think that that's probably correct. And it's another example of just how dire the situation has become. But the consequences of that, in terms of the human right to housing, is that we need to rehabilitate respect for tenancy as a form of housing, and then act on that by having laws which protect residential tenancy as a form of housing which needs to be respected and protected just like any other form of housing. And at the moment, we, coming back to values, we don't respect very much residential tenancy as a form of housing. We see it as second best, and our laws have very much treated residential tenancy as second best housing because they're second best. So residential tenancy laws need to be reformed. They need to ensure that rented housing is safe, it's secure, it has minimum standards, that rents are not increased willy-nilly, and most importantly, the scourge of eviction without cause needs to be ended. There must not be eviction without just cause. There must only be eviction for cause. Now, the trend is towards that kind of reform. I can give you examples. In Sydney, for example, I saw announced only yesterday the intention of the government to go in that direction. It must do so, and without strong residential tenancy laws, people who have tenancy as a form of housing will never be able to achieve the same sort of housing security, which is necessary for them to flourish in ordinary life in the same way as everybody else.
Yeah. So, Kevin, if we are to adopt a nationwide approach and certainly, realignment of mindset, what is the role of people in the community? Be it lawyers who might be listening to this episode, other working professionals like accountants, yes, real estate agents. Yes. What is their duty here in ensuring that we can move towards having housing as a human right?
There's a role for everybody here. People who build, people who invest, people who support this kind of activity, people who are engaged in legal regulation, people who are engaged in the helping services. There's a role for everybody here. But I'm asking for everybody to educate themselves about the role of human rights in relation to housing, to examine their own consciences, to reflect upon the way that they themselves have considered housing in their own lives. One of the things I've tried to do in the book is to unpack the reasons why this has happened, not to blame anybody, not to take a political approach to this and to point a finger at that party or this party. But I do ask that people educate themselves about what is happening, which is terrible, to educate themselves about the causes of it, which can be understood, though it is complex, to move from seeing housing as a source of profit to seeing housing as the foundation for human life in all of its dimensions, and to ask more of government than is presently being asked, and not just to see this as a question of supply, as important as that is. It's not just a question of supply. It's a question of values and rights.
Yeah. As another way to sort of hammer home the importance of this realignment, Kevin, perhaps it would be worth you spelling out the potential worst case scenario if we move forward without meaningful action. So from your perspective, having literally written the book on it, what would it look like for this disaster to become even worse, to become catastrophic, as you noted in the book?
This has been going on for 2 generations. So a generation is 25 years. We're here in 2024, and for 2 generations, the situation has been worsening to the point that we have just described. Housing unaffordability, people not having access to housing, homelessness, public investment in social housing being so low, and a lack of transformative intent among those who are trying to do something at the moment. So the catastrophe will be that in 2 generations we will have the same problem. So that's for 4 generations, for 100 years. Yeah. Australia will be in a situation where we have not created the circumstances in which having a decent home is possible for ordinary people. Yeah. That is, I think, that's not the kind of Australia that I want to be associated with. Yeah. It will be a catastrophe if we have this for another 2 generations. The word crisis at present doesn't cut it. It is a disaster, but I am concerned about the situation becoming catastrophic, and we need to do much more, not just in terms of spending money, but reframing and recharacterising the whole debate, so that enduring longer-term change can happen. And I believe that adopting a human rights approach and acting on it, not just talking about it, is one way to avoid that looming catastrophe.
Kevin, just finally, what's your level of optimism that we as a country can move forward, with such a human rights approach to housing and ensure that those marginalised groups that are currently suffering the worst of this housing disaster are able to be better supported and sheltered? Are you optimistic that we can achieve this?
I am optimistic because I think that it is necessary. I don't think we can escape the catastrophe without it. And I think that realisation may be gradually acquired, but I think it will be acquired.
Kevin Bell, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Jerome.
To everyone who did listen along, I hope you found it a lot of food for thought. If you like this episode, like or review us on whatever platform that you do listen to your podcasts on. Any questions, editor@smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. Until next time, stay up to date with all the latest on our website. Subscribe to our bulletin if you have not already, and check us out on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Stay safe and well. Until next time, bye-bye.
The information featured in this podcast is general in nature and does not take into consideration your financial situation or individual needs and should not be relied upon. Before making any investment, insurance, tax, property or financial planning decision, you should consult a licensed professional who can advise whether your decision is appropriate for you. Guests appearing on this podcast may have a commercial relationship with the companies mentioned.
Feeling trapped by rising interest payments? Escape from mortgage prison with expert refinancing assistance from Finny. We have helped hundreds of borrowers break free from higher loan repayments by finding a more suitable loan. Our expert team can quickly assess your situation, and if there's a better lender available, we'll find it fast. Don't delay. Call today. Speak to a Finny mortgage specialist on 02 8866 2444 or visit our website at www.finny.com.au.